My brother told me to skip my graduation to babysit his kids and called me an attention seeker for choosing hats and gowns. So I gave him a nightmare vacation. My brother Kevin called me 2 weeks before my college graduation with amazing news. He'd booked a surprise anniversary trip to Hawaii for his wife and needed me to watch his 3 kids for 5 days. He didn't ask if I was available, just told me the dates and said he'd drop them off the night before. I told him those exact dates were my graduation ceremony and graduation party that I'd been planning for months. Kevin laughed and said I could walk at the next ceremony in December. When I explained this was my master's degree ceremony after 6 years of night school while working full-time, he said it was just a walk across a stage and his anniversary only happened once a year. He actually said my education would still be there later, but Hawaii tickets were non-refundable. I reminded him I'd already invited 50 people to watch me graduate, including our grandmother who was flying in from Florida. Kevin said I was being selfish, putting a piece of paper over family. He said his kids needed their aunt more than I needed to wear a silly hat and gown. When I said no, he got angry and said I'd already been his backup plan and told his wife about the trip. He couldn't disappoint her now over my need for attention. He said real adults didn't need ceremonies to feel accomplished, and I was being immature wanting people to clap for me. I asked why he couldn't get a babysitter, and he said he didn't trust strangers with his kids, and family was supposed to help each other. He'd watched his kids for free their whole lives, but somehow I owed him for being their aunt. Kevin had pulled this before when I was supposed to take the LSAT. He'd shown up with his kids saying it was an emergency, and I'd missed my test date. When I graduated with my bachelor's, he'd brought his sick kids to the ceremony, and I'd spent the whole time in the bathroom with his vomiting toddler instead of walking. Every milestone I'd had, Kevin had found a way to make it about his needs. But this time I had a plan. I told Kevin I'd watch the kids and he could drop them off the morning of his flight. He was thrilled and started talking about how this would be good practice for when I had my own kids someday. The morning came and Kevin dropped off his 3 kids at 7 for a 9 o'clock flight. The kids were excited because I'd told them about the special surprise I had planned. As soon as Kevin left for the airport, I dressed his kids in their best clothes and told them we were going to a very important party. We arrived at my graduation venue where all my guests were waiting. I'd told everyone that my nephew and nieces would be special guests at my ceremony. The kids sat in the front row wearing signs I'd made saying, "Our aunt is amazing," and first in the family to get a master's. When my name was called, 3 little voices screamed, "That's our aunt!" louder than anyone else. The whole auditorium laughed and clapped extra hard. My 8-year-old niece Mariana took pictures with my phone while the 5-year-old twins threw flower petals I'd given them. After the ceremony, we went to my graduation party at a restaurant. I'd arranged a special kids' table with coloring books about college, graduation caps they could decorate, and mocktails with umbrellas. The kids told everyone who would listen about how their aunt was the smartest person in the world and had worked so hard for this degree. They sang the graduation song they'd learned in the car. My grandmother made them honorary graduates and gave them candy diplomas. The kids had the time of their lives being the center of attention at an adult party where everyone treated them like VIPs. Meanwhile, Kevin and his wife landed in Hawaii and discovered their hotel had been canceled. Kevin had given me his credit card for emergencies with the kids, and I'd used it to cancel their reservation since clearly the kids graduating with me were an emergency. They had to pay triple for a last-minute booking at a different hotel. Kevin called, furious, shouting that I was a psycho who'd ruined his marriage and he would beat me once he came back. I hung up on Kevin and silenced my phone, watching the screen light up with text after text. My friends crowded around the kids' table where Mariana was showing everyone the photos she'd taken during the ceremony. The twins were making their 3rd trip to the dessert table, their faces covered in chocolate frosting. Grandmother Lynette sat at the head table with my degree propped up next to her plate, telling anyone who'd listen about how proud she was. My best friend from work grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the dance floor, where a group had started dancing to the restaurant's playlist. I let myself get swept up in the celebration, refusing to look at my phone even though I could feel it buzzing in my pocket every few seconds. The kids joined us on the dance floor, and Ryder tried to teach everyone his version of the floss while his sisters collapsed in giggles. My phone kept vibrating, but I ignored it, focusing instead on Zoe's determined face as she attempted to spin like a ballerina. The restaurant manager came over to congratulate me and mentioned that the kids had told him at least 5 times that their aunt was the smartest person in the world. I danced with my grandmother, who moved slower than everyone else but refused to sit down, and she whispered that this was exactly the kind of celebration I deserved. My phone buzzed again, and I finally pulled it out to see 17 new messages, all from Kevin, each one more angry than the last. I read the first few where he called me selfish and manipulative before putting it back in my pocket. The party went on for another 2 hours, and the kids never stopped smiling, completely unaware that their father was having a meltdown 3,000 miles away. The restaurant closed at 9, and everyone started heading home. I loaded the kids into my car with their party favors and leftover cake while they chattered about their favorite parts of the day. My phone had stopped buzzing as much, but when I checked it at a red light, I saw I had 6 voicemails. I waited until I got the kids settled at my apartment with a movie before I went into my bedroom and closed the door. The first voicemail started with Kevin screaming so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. He called me every name he could think of, his voice getting higher and more frantic as he described finding out the hotel was canceled. The second message was worse, with him threatening to tell everyone in the family what a horrible person I was. By the third voicemail, his voice had changed from angry to something darker, promising that he would make sure I regretted this decision. The fourth message focused on money, with Kevin listing every dollar the hotel cancellation had cost him and demanding I pay him back immediately. In the fifth voicemail, he brought up every time I'd ever disappointed him, going back to childhood incidents I'd forgotten about. The final message was the worst, with Kevin's voice dropping to a threatening whisper as he said he'd deal with me when he got back and I'd better watch myself. I saved all the voicemails and took screenshots of his text messages, something telling me I might need evidence of his threats later. My hands were shaking when I came back out to check on the kids, but they were absorbed in their movie and didn't notice. Grandmother Lynette called around 10 to say goodnight before heading to her hotel. I stepped onto my apartment balcony so the kids wouldn't hear our conversation. She asked how I was holding up, and I admitted that Kevin's messages had been pretty intense. There was a long pause before she told me she needed to share something with me. Her voice got quiet as she explained that Kevin had pulled similar stunts throughout his life, always expecting everyone to rearrange their plans for his convenience. She brought up her retirement party 15 years ago, when Kevin had insisted she reschedule it because he'd booked a fishing trip that same weekend. My grandmother had actually changed the date, and half her friends couldn't come to the new one. Then there was my aunt's wedding, where Kevin had caused a huge scene because the ceremony conflicted with his son's baseball game, demanding the wedding start 2 hours earlier. My aunt had refused, and Kevin had shown up late, making a big entrance that drew attention away from the bride. Grandmother Lynette's voice cracked slightly as she said she was proud of me for finally standing up to him. She admitted she'd been too soft on Kevin when he was growing up, always giving in to his demands because it was easier than dealing with his tantrums. She said someone needed to show him that the world didn't revolve around his schedule and his wants. I felt tears starting as she told me she was glad I had the courage to do what she should have done years ago. We talked for 20 more minutes about Kevin's pattern of behavior and how it had affected the whole family. Before hanging up, she made me promise not to let him guilt me into apologizing. My alarm went off at 7 the next morning, and I grabbed my phone out of habit. The screen showed 43 notifications in the family group chat. I scrolled to the top to see where it started, and found a long message from Kevin posted at midnight Hawaii time. He'd written a detailed account of what happened, claiming I'd agreed to watch his kids at my apartment, and then sabotaged his marriage by canceling his hotel reservation out of pure spite. According to his version, I'd been jealous of his happy marriage and deliberately tried to ruin his anniversary trip. The messages that followed showed my mom asking me to call her immediately, my dad wanting to know what really happened, and my aunt defending Kevin. My aunt had written 3 paragraphs about how I should have just rescheduled my graduation for December like Kevin suggested, and that family should always come first. 2 of my uncles had chimed in saying they were disappointed in me. My cousin had posted a single question mark. I sat on my bed reading through all the messages while the kids slept in my living room. Kevin had painted himself as the victim and made me look like a vindictive sister who couldn't handle not being the center of attention. Several family members had already taken his side without even asking for my perspective. My mom's message was the hardest to read because she sounded genuinely worried that I'd done something terrible. I spent 20 minutes crafting a response in my notes app before posting it. I opened the family chat and posted my response, keeping my tone calm and factual. I explained that I'd told Kevin I would watch the kids and never promised to skip my ceremony. I attached 3 photos from the graduation showing Mariana, Zoe, and Ryder in the front row with their signs, throwing flower petals and posing with my diploma. I wrote that the kids had attended my graduation as my special guests and had a wonderful time being part of such an important family milestone. Then I attached a screenshot of Kevin's original text message where he demanded I skip my graduation and called it just a walk across the stage. I included his message saying real adults didn't need ceremonies, and I was being immature for wanting people to clap for me. The final screenshot showed him saying his Hawaii tickets were non-refundable, so my education would have to wait. I hit send and watched the message appear in the chat. For 20 minutes, nothing happened. The chat showed that 15 people had read my message, but nobody responded. I could imagine them all reading Kevin's text in his own words, seeing how he'd actually talked to me. My phone stayed silent except for the kids waking up and asking what was for breakfast. I made them pancakes while checking the group chat every few minutes, but it remained completely quiet. The silence felt heavier than all of Kevin's angry messages combined. A private message popped up from my cousin Sarah while I was cleaning up breakfast dishes. She wrote that she'd been waiting years for someone to call out Kevin's manipulation, and she was glad I'd finally done it. Her message continued with a story I'd never heard before about her engagement party 3 years ago. Kevin had called her 2 days before the party saying he needed her to babysit his kids because his regular sitter had canceled. Sarah had explained that she couldn't miss her own engagement party, but Kevin had insisted, saying family helped each other in emergencies. She'd ended up leaving her party early to pick up his kids, missing the speeches and the cake cutting. Later, she'd found out Kevin's regular sitter hadn't canceled at all. He'd just decided he didn't want to pay for childcare that weekend. Sarah's message said at least 6 other family members had similar stories, but nobody wanted to rock the boat by confronting him. She listed names of relatives who'd missed important events or rearranged their lives because Kevin had claimed he needed urgent help. My uncle had missed his daughter's school play. My other cousin had skipped a job interview. My aunt had canceled a vacation. The pattern went back years, and everyone had just accepted it as Kevin being Kevin. Sarah wrote that she was proud of me for standing up to him, and hoped it would inspire others to set boundaries too. She ended by saying the screenshots I'd posted had opened a lot of people's eyes to how Kevin actually treated family members. An unknown number called my phone around noon, and I answered thinking it might be someone from the restaurant about yesterday's party. Instead, a man's voice immediately started yelling at me, saying I'd ruined his best friend's marriage. It took me a minute to realize this was Kevin's college roommate who I'd met maybe twice at family events. He launched into a rant about how Allegra was threatening divorce over the Hawaii disaster, and it was all my fault. He said Kevin was a good man who'd asked his sister for one simple favor, and I'd responded by destroying his anniversary trip. I let him finish his whole speech before calmly asking if he'd seen the text messages Kevin had sent me. He said that didn't matter because family was supposed to help each other. I asked him point blank if he would miss his own graduation ceremony for someone else's vacation. There was a pause before he said that was different. I asked how it was different, and he stammered something about Kevin having already paid for the trip. I pointed out that I'd already invited 50 people to watch me graduate after 6 years of night school while working full-time. He went quiet, so I asked again if he would personally skip his master's degree graduation to babysit someone else's kids. He muttered that I was twisting things around and then hung up without saying goodbye. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone and feeling oddly satisfied that even Kevin's best friend couldn't actually defend his behavior when pressed on the specifics. The kids were playing in my living room when my phone rang again on the second day of Kevin's trip. I saw Allegra's name and my stomach dropped. I stepped onto the balcony and answered, bracing myself for her to scream at me like Kevin had. Instead, her voice came through very quiet, almost hesitant. She asked if Kevin had really told me to skip my master's graduation to babysit. I confirmed that he had and offered to send her the text thread. She said yes, so I forwarded her the entire conversation while she waited on the line. I could hear background noise that sounded like a hotel lobby or restaurant. 30 seconds passed in complete silence after I sent the messages. Then she asked in the same quiet voice if the kids had actually enjoyed the ceremony. The question surprised me so much I almost didn't answer. I told her they'd had a wonderful time and had been the loudest cheerers in the whole auditorium. She asked what else they'd done, and I described the special kids' table at the party with the coloring books and mocktails. Another long pause followed before Allegra asked if I'd really made them signs to hold. I said I had, and that everyone at the ceremony had loved seeing 3 little kids so excited about their aunt's graduation. Her voice got even quieter as she asked if I had photos. I sent her a few pictures of the kids throwing flower petals and holding their signs. Allegra started crying on the phone, not loud sobbing, but quiet tears I could hear in her breathing. She said Kevin had told her I'd agreed to watch the kids at my apartment and never mentioned anything about it being my graduation day. She kept repeating that she was so sorry, that she'd had no idea, that she never would have gone along with the trip if she'd known. I told her it was okay, and that the kids really had enjoyed themselves. She said it wasn't okay because she'd been part of forcing me to choose between my education and family. Her voice got stronger as she talked, the tears stopping as anger replaced the guilt. She said Kevin had specifically told her that I'd volunteered to take the kids, and was happy to help with their anniversary trip. He'd made it sound like I was doing them a favor, not that he'd demanded I sacrifice my own milestone. Allegra asked about the hotel cancellation, and I explained that Kevin had given me his credit card for emergencies with the kids. I'd decided that his children attending their aunt's graduation ceremony definitely qualified as an emergency worth the expense. She laughed, a short bitter sound, and said she couldn't even argue with that logic. Then she told me she needed to go talk to Kevin and hung up. I stood on my balcony for a long time after, wondering what that conversation was going to sound like. Allegra called back an hour later, and this time her voice shook with anger instead of tears. She said Kevin had been complaining for months about how I never helped with the kids, and always put my education first. He'd made her think I was selfish and didn't care about family. She'd believed him because why would her husband lie about his own sister? Now she was going through their conversations and realizing how many times Kevin had twisted situations to make me look bad. He'd told her I'd canceled on babysitting at the last minute multiple times when really he'd asked me during finals week, or on days I'd already told him I was working. He'd said I'd refused to come to the kids' birthday parties when actually he'd scheduled them during my class times and wouldn't move them. Allegra's voice cracked as she listed example after example of Kevin lying to make me seem like a terrible aunt who couldn't be bothered with family. She said she'd judged me based on his version of events, and never thought to question why I would be so consistently selfish. Now she understood that Kevin had been lying to make sure she wouldn't question why I was never available for his last-minute childcare demands. She apologized again, and said she was going to need time to process what this meant about her marriage. I didn't know what to say, so I just told her I was sorry she was dealing with this. She said she wasn't the one who deserved an apology. I hung up with Allegra feeling like the ground had shifted under my feet. My phone buzzed almost immediately with a new call, and I saw Kevin's parents' number flash across the screen. I let it ring twice before answering because I knew exactly what was coming. Kevin's mom started talking before I could even say hello, her voice sharp and demanding as she told me I needed to apologize to Kevin immediately and pay him back for the hotel charges. She said I had no right to use his credit card without permission, and what I did was basically theft. I waited until she finished her speech and then reminded her very calmly that Kevin had given me that card specifically for emergencies with the kids. His children attending their aunt's graduation ceremony after he tried to make me miss it absolutely qualified as an emergency in my book. She started to argue, but I told her I had to go check on the kids and hung up before she could launch into the guilt trip I could hear building in her voice. My hands were shaking as I set the phone down on the kitchen counter, and I realized I'd been holding my breath through most of that conversation. The doorbell rang 20 minutes later, and I opened it to find Davina standing there with 2 bottles of wine and a bag of takeout. She took one look at my face and pushed past me into the apartment, heading straight for my kitchen to grab wine glasses. She poured us each a generous amount, and then made me sit down at the table and recount the entire story from the beginning. I told her everything, from Kevin's original demand that I skip graduation, to the hotel cancellation, to Allegra's phone calls, and by the end, Davina was staring at me with her mouth hanging open. She set down her wine glass and declared that I was officially her hero for finally standing up to Kevin's manipulation after all these years. She reminded me of all the times I'd rearranged my life for his convenience, like when I'd canceled my birthday dinner because he needed a babysitter, or when I'd worked from his house for a week when his kids had chicken pox. Davina said watching those 3 kids cheer for me at graduation was the perfect response to years of Kevin treating my achievements like they didn't matter. She raised her glass and made me toast to finally putting myself first, and I felt some of the tension leave my shoulders as we clinked glasses together. The kids were in the living room building a blanket fort when my phone rang again 2 days later. I saw my mom's number and my stomach dropped because I knew Kevin must have gotten to her. I answered and she launched right into it, saying I should have been the bigger person and just rescheduled my graduation ceremony for December, like Kevin suggested. Her voice had that disappointed tone that always made me feel like I was 10 years old again and had done something wrong. I tried to explain that this was my master's degree after 6 years of night school while working full-time, and that 50 people had been there to watch me walk, including her own mother who flew in from Florida. My mom cut me off and said family should always come first no matter what, and now Kevin's marriage was in trouble because of my selfishness. She said Allegra was threatening to leave him and take the kids, and it was all my fault for being petty about a ceremony. I could feel my blood pressure rising as she talked, and I had to grip the phone tighter to keep from throwing it across the room. I took 3 deep breaths before responding, because I was actively stopping myself from screaming at my mom that Kevin's marriage problems weren't my responsibility. Instead, I asked her in the calmest voice I could manage how many of my life events she'd like me to sacrifice before I was finally allowed to prioritize myself. I reminded her that Kevin had already made me miss my LSAT and ruined my bachelor's graduation, and this was supposed to be my moment after years of hard work. My mom went completely quiet on the other end, and I could hear her breathing change. She said in a much softer voice that she'd call me back later because she needed to think about what I'd said. I knew that meant she was going to talk to my dad about whose side to take in this family drama. After we hung up, I sat on my couch staring at the wall for a long time while the kids played happily in their fort, completely unaware that their parents' marriage was falling apart in Hawaii. My phone rang again that evening, and this time it was grandmother Lynette calling from her hotel. She told me not to let my mother guilt me about the graduation situation, and then she shared something I'd never known before. She said my mom had always made excuses for Kevin because he was the oldest child, and she had different expectations for him than she had for me. Lynette explained that when Kevin was young, he'd throw massive tantrums until he got his way, and my mom had learned to just give in rather than deal with the screaming. She said it was a pattern she recognized from her own parenting mistakes with my mom, and she was sorry I'd had to deal with the consequences of that for so many years. Lynette told me she was proud of me for standing up for myself, and that my grandfather would have been proud too. Her voice got emotional as she said she wished she'd done more to stop this pattern when Kevin was younger, instead of watching him manipulate everyone around him. I thanked her and told her it meant everything to hear that from her. And after we hung up, I felt like at least one person in this family understood what I'd been dealing with. The kids stayed with me for 2 more full days, and they couldn't stop talking about the graduation like it was the best day of their entire lives. They made crafts about college using construction paper and glitter, cutting out little graduation caps and writing my name on diplomas they decorated with stickers. Ryder and Zoe kept playing graduation ceremony with their stuffed animals, making them walk across the coffee table while they cheered and threw imaginary flower petals. Mariana asked me very seriously if she could come to my next graduation when I became a doctor, because she wanted to throw more real flower petals. I had to explain that I was done with school now and wouldn't be having any more graduation ceremonies, but I was incredibly touched that she thought I was smart enough to become a doctor. She looked disappointed for a moment and then brightened up and said maybe she could have her own graduation someday, and I could come throw flower petals for her. I promised her I would absolutely be there for her graduation no matter what, and she hugged me, so tight I could barely breathe. My phone buzzed with a text from Sean, my coworker who'd helped me plan the graduation party at the restaurant. He said the party had been amazing and asked if I was okay, because he'd overheard me on the phone yesterday with someone who sounded really angry. I texted him back with the basic rundown of what had happened, explaining that my brother had tried to make me miss my graduation to babysit, and was now furious that I'd taken his kids to the ceremony instead. Sean responded immediately saying he was absolutely shocked that my own brother would try to make me miss my master's graduation after 6 years of night school. He said anyone who knew me at work knew how hard I'd worked for that degree, and how much it meant to me. Then he offered to be a character witness if I ever needed someone to confirm I wasn't actually a selfish monster, which made me laugh for the first time in hours. I thanked him and said I might take him up on that offer if my family kept acting like I'd committed some terrible crime. On the 4th day of Kevin and Allegra's Hawaii trip, Allegra called me again, and her voice sounded different from before. She told me she'd confronted Kevin about lying to her about my availability and his demands that I skip graduation to babysit. She said he'd initially denied the whole thing and tried to say I was exaggerating, but she'd shown him the text messages I'd sent her with screenshots of his original conversation. Kevin had finally admitted it, but then got defensive, saying my graduation wasn't as important as their marriage, and I should have understood that. Allegra said they were now barely speaking to each other in their hotel room, and the rest of the vacation had been completely ruined by the tension between them. She sounded exhausted and sad as she described how Kevin kept trying to make her see his side while refusing to acknowledge that what he'd done to me was wrong. I didn't know what to say because part of me felt guilty that their marriage was suffering even though I knew logically that wasn't my fault. Allegra started asking me detailed questions about the other times Kevin had disrupted my major life events. I told her about the LSAT situation where he'd shown up claiming an emergency, and I'd missed my test date entirely, having to wait months to reschedule. I described my bachelor's graduation where he'd brought his sick kids to the ceremony, and I'd spent the whole time in the bathroom with his vomiting toddler instead of walking across the stage. Allegra sounded genuinely shocked as I listed example after example, and she said she'd had no idea the pattern was this extensive and went back so many years. She told me she was starting to realize her husband had a serious problem with respecting other people's boundaries and always putting his own needs first. Her voice cracked a little as she said she didn't know what this meant for their marriage, but she couldn't ignore it anymore now that she saw the full picture. I felt bad for her because she was clearly processing a lot of uncomfortable truths about the man she'd married and the father of her children. My dad finally called later that same evening, and I braced myself for another lecture about family unity. Instead, he took what he called a neutral stance, saying both Kevin and I had made choices that escalated the situation beyond what it needed to be. He said we needed to sit down and talk it out like adults when Kevin got back from Hawaii, so we could move past this as a family. I appreciated that he wasn't automatically siding with Kevin the way my mom had, but I was frustrated that he was treating this like a both sides issue when the facts were pretty clear. Kevin had a decade-long pattern of manipulating me into sacrificing my important moments for his convenience, and I'd finally said no. I told my dad I was willing to talk, but I wasn't going to apologize for attending my own graduation ceremony, and he said that was fair enough. After we hung up, I realized that even though my dad was trying to be diplomatic, at least he wasn't demanding I make things right with Kevin like everyone else seemed to expect. The family group chat lit up around lunchtime the next day. My aunt posted this long message about how family is forever, and we needed to remember forgiveness and unity during hard times. She suggested we all get together when Kevin got back from Hawaii to work through our differences as a family. I stared at my phone while the message sat there for maybe 2 minutes. Then my cousin replied that maybe Kevin should apologize first before everyone gathered to make him feel better about what he did. 3 thumbs-up reactions popped up on her message within seconds. I watched more relatives add their thumbs up until there were 6 total. Nobody responded to my aunt's message about unity. I put my phone down and focused on getting through the rest of the day with the kids. That evening, I picked up pizza from the place the kids always begged for when they stayed over. We sat at my small kitchen table with paper plates, and the twins were fighting over who got the last breadstick. Ryder suddenly got quiet and looked at me with these serious eyes. He asked why his daddy sounded so angry on the phone yesterday. He said he heard his mommy crying in the bathroom after they talked. My stomach dropped, but I kept my voice normal. I told him sometimes grown-ups have disagreements, but everything would be okay. He nodded and went back to his pizza, but I could tell he was still thinking about it. I spent the rest of dinner trying not to panic about how much these kids were picking up on. They were supposed to be having fun at their aunt's place, not worrying about their parents fighting in Hawaii. After dinner, we were cleaning up when Mariana came over and stood really close to me. She had this look on her face like she was about to say something important. She told me very seriously that she wanted to go to college like me someday. Then she asked if her daddy would try to make her miss her graduation too. The question hit me so hard I had to grab the counter. This 8-year-old had already figured out her father's pattern. She'd watched him try to ruin my graduation and connected it to her own future. I knelt down so I was at her eye level and promised her I would be there for her graduation no matter what. I told her she could be anything she wanted and nobody would stop her from celebrating her achievements. She hugged me tight and whispered thank you. I held her for a minute, trying not to cry because this little girl shouldn't have to worry about this stuff. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a text from Kevin. He and Allegra were coming back early from Hawaii. They'd cut their trip short by a whole day because the tension between them made the vacation impossible. Kevin said he was coming to pick up his kids and we needed to talk. My stomach dropped when I read it. This confrontation had been building since the moment he called from the airport 5 days ago. I knew it was going to be bad. I texted back that he could pick up the kids, but we weren't having any conversation until he calmed down. I reminded him that he threatened to beat me in his last voicemail. The message sat there for a few minutes before he responded. He said I was being dramatic and he was just angry when he said that. He promised he'd keep it civil for the kids' sake. I didn't believe him, but at least now I had it in writing that he'd stay calm. Around 3 in the afternoon, my neighbor knocked on my door. She looked worried and told me there was a man sitting in a car outside my building. He'd been there for 20 minutes just staring up at the windows. I thanked her and went to look out my front window. Kevin's car was parked right across the street. I could see him in the driver's seat just sitting there. He was working himself up to whatever he planned to say to me. My hands started shaking. I pulled out my phone and called Davina. I asked if she could come over as a buffer for when Kevin came up. She said she'd be there in 15 minutes and asked if I wanted her to bring her boyfriend. I said yes without even thinking about it. Her boyfriend was this big guy who played rugby, and I knew Kevin wouldn't try anything with him standing there. I wasn't actually scared Kevin would hurt me with witnesses around, but I wanted him to know I wasn't facing him alone. Davina and her boyfriend showed up 12 minutes later. They barely had time to sit down before there was a knock at my door. I looked through the peephole and saw Kevin standing there. His face was bright red from sunburn and he looked completely worn out. I opened the door and he barely glanced at me before asking where his kids were. The kids heard his voice and came running from the bedroom. They were so excited to see him and started talking over each other about graduation. Mariana pulled out my phone to show him the photos she'd taken. I watched Kevin's jaw get tight as he scrolled through pictures of his kids holding signs about their amazing aunt. His face got redder with each photo. The kids ran to gather their stuff from the bedroom. Kevin turned to me and said we weren't done with this conversation. He expected me to make things right with his wife. I looked him straight in the eye and told him I had nothing to make right. I kept his kids safe and gave them a wonderful experience. If his marriage was in trouble, it was because of his own lies. I kept my voice calm even though my heart was pounding. Kevin's face went completely red and he opened his mouth to say something harsh. Then Davina's boyfriend stood up from the couch and took one step forward. He didn't say anything or make any threatening moves. He just stood there. Kevin looked at him and seemed to think better of whatever he was about to say. He called to his kids to get in the car. The twins came running with their backpacks and Mariana followed carrying the stuffed animal I'd bought her. Kevin walked toward the door and then stopped. He said over his shoulder that the family was going to hear about what kind of person I really am. He said I'd regret choosing a piece of paper over family. Then he walked out with his kids following behind him. I closed the door and leaned against it. My legs felt weak. The whole thing was over in less than 5 minutes, but it felt like hours. I slid down to the floor and pulled my knees to my chest. Davina sat down next to me and put her arm around my shoulders. I started crying and couldn't stop. It wasn't the big dramatic breakdown I expected. It was just this quiet, exhausted crying where I couldn't catch my breath properly. Davina didn't say anything at first. She just held me and let me cry. Her boyfriend stood near the door for a minute, then quietly said he'd wait in the car to give us privacy. After he left, Davina pulled me closer and told me I did nothing wrong. She said Kevin's anger was just him realizing he couldn't control me anymore. She said he'd spent years making me feel guilty for having my own life, and now he was losing that power. I wiped my face on my sleeve and told her I felt stupid for crying. She said I wasn't stupid. She said standing up to family was harder than standing up to strangers because family knew exactly which buttons to push. We sat on the floor for another 20 minutes while I calmed down. Davina made me drink water and reminded me that I'd just walked at my graduation with 3 kids cheering for me while Kevin was stuck paying triple for a hotel. She said that was a win no matter how much he yelled about it. The next day, my phone stayed quiet. No angry texts from Kevin, no voicemails from his wife, no messages in the family group chat. It was almost weird after 5 days of constant notifications. Around noon, I got a text from Allegra. She asked if we could meet for coffee without Kevin knowing. I stared at the message for a full minute. I didn't expect to hear from her at all, let alone without Kevin. I texted back that I could meet her. We agreed on a cafe halfway between our places for the next afternoon. I spent the rest of the day wondering what she wanted to say. Part of me worried it was a trap. Maybe Kevin sent her to yell at me in person. Maybe she wanted to guilt me about their marriage problems. But another part of me hoped she just wanted to hear my side of things. I got to the cafe 15 minutes early and ordered coffee. I sat at a corner table where I could see the door. Allegra walked in exactly on time, looking completely worn out. She had bags under her eyes and her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. She ordered tea and sat down across from me without making eye contact at first. She wrapped both hands around her cup and stared at it for a few seconds. Then she looked up and told me she hadn't been sleeping. She said she'd been thinking about all the times Kevin manipulated situations to his advantage. I stayed quiet and let her talk. She started listing examples I didn't even know about. She said Kevin told her parents she was too busy for visits when really he just didn't want to drive there. He canceled plans with her friends by claiming the babysitter fell through when he never actually called one. He told her sister they couldn't make it to her birthday because the kids were sick, but the kids were fine and he just wanted to watch a football game. She said once she started looking for the pattern, she saw it everywhere. Allegra put her cup down and looked straight at me. She said Kevin had been painting me as the selfish sister who refused to help with family for years. She believed him because she had no reason to question his version of events. She apologized for judging me without knowing the full story. Her voice cracked a little when she said she was sorry. Then she told me she'd given Kevin an ultimatum. Either he started marriage counseling or she was taking the kids to her parents' house. She said she meant it. She wasn't going to raise her kids thinking it was okay to lie and manipulate people to get what you want. I told her I appreciated the apology, but she didn't need to apologize for believing her husband. She shook her head and said she should have questioned things more. She said there were signs and she ignored them because it was easier. I was careful with my words because this was still her husband and the father of her kids. But I did share the full history of Kevin disrupting my milestones. I told her about missing my LSAT because he showed up with an emergency that wasn't really an emergency. I told her about spending my bachelor's graduation in the bathroom with his sick kid while everyone else walked. I told her about every time he'd expected me to drop everything for his convenience and made me feel guilty when I said no. Allegra's face got more upset with each story. She said she saw now that his behavior wasn't just about me. It was a pattern of prioritizing his needs over everyone else's. She said she'd been making excuses for him because she loved him and wanted to believe he was just stressed or overwhelmed. But now she realized it was deeper than that. We talked for 2 hours. Allegra ordered another tea and I got a second coffee. She told me Kevin's parents had always enabled this behavior by bailing him out of consequences and expecting others to accommodate him. She said his mom called her yesterday demanding she forgive him and stop making a big deal out of one ruined vacation. That phone call made her realize the problem ran deeper than just Kevin. His whole family had trained him to expect special treatment. She said his mom actually told her that Kevin was sensitive and needed extra support, like he was still a child instead of a grown man with 3 kids. Allegra said that conversation opened her eyes more than anything else. She saw where Kevin learned to act this way, and why he thought it was acceptable. Before we left, Allegra asked if I'd be willing to attend a family therapy session with her and Kevin. She said a professional needed to hear both sides. I hesitated because I didn't want to be dragged into their marriage problems. She reached across the table and touched my hand. She said it would help to have someone who could speak to Kevin's pattern of behavior beyond just her observations. She said the therapist needed to hear from someone outside their marriage who'd experienced the same manipulation. I thought about it for a minute. Part of me wanted to say no and stay out of their mess. But another part of me knew Allegra was trying to fix things and needed support. I agreed to one session but made it clear I was doing this to support her, not to reconcile with Kevin on his terms. I told her I wasn't interested in family mediation where everyone pretends the problem is equal on both sides. She nodded and said she understood. She said the therapist would focus on Kevin's behavior patterns, not on making me compromise or apologize. Allegra hugged me before we left the cafe. She said she was grateful I stood up for myself because it opened her eyes to things she'd been ignoring. She said watching Kevin's reaction to not getting his way showed her how much he expected everyone to bend to his needs. She thanked me for being honest with her even though it was uncomfortable. That evening my mom called. Her tone was completely different from the last time we talked. She sounded less angry and more worried. She said she'd been talking to my dad and grandmother about everything that happened. She admitted she'd been making excuses for Kevin's behavior for too long. She said she was sorry for not supporting me right away. She said she should have recognized the pattern years ago instead of telling me to be more flexible. I didn't say anything at first because I wasn't sure if this was real or if she'd change her mind again tomorrow. She kept talking and told me she'd been thinking about all the times she chose Kevin's comfort over my needs. She said she didn't realize how much damage that had done until grandmother pointed it out to her. My mom's voice got quieter. She told me that when Kevin was younger, she always gave in to his demands because he'd throw tantrums until he got his way. She said she took the path of least resistance because it was easier than dealing with his meltdowns. She realized now that she trained him to expect everyone to accommodate him. She said it was her fault he turned out this way, and she was sorry I had to pay the price for her parenting mistakes. She told me she was proud of me for setting boundaries even though it caused family conflict. She said she'd support whatever relationship I chose to have with Kevin going forward. She wouldn't pressure me to make peace or accommodate him anymore. I thanked her and told her I appreciated the apology. We talked for another 30 minutes about how things would be different going forward. She promised to treat us equally, instead of expecting me to always be the one who compromised. When we hung up, I felt lighter than I had in days. A week passed before the therapy appointment. I spent most of that time working and trying not to think about sitting in a room with Kevin while a stranger picked apart our family problems. The morning of the session, I changed my outfit 3 times because nothing felt right for confronting your brother's manipulation with professional help. I settled on jeans and a sweater that made me look calm, even though my stomach was doing flips. The therapist's office was in a building downtown with those uncomfortable waiting room chairs that make you sit up straight. Kevin and Allegra were already there when I arrived. Kevin had his arms crossed tight against his chest and wouldn't look at me. His jaw was set in that way that meant he was ready to fight. Allegra looked tired but focused, like she'd been preparing for this all week. She gave me a small smile and mouthed, "Thank you." I sat across from them and picked up a magazine I didn't read. The therapist called us in after 10 minutes. Her office had soft lighting and plants everywhere, probably meant to make people relax, but I felt more tense walking in. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a notepad. She introduced herself and explained how the session would work. Everyone would get a chance to share their view without being interrupted. Then we'd talk through the patterns she noticed. Kevin shifted in his seat like he wanted to bolt. The therapist started by asking each of us why we were here. Kevin jumped in first without waiting. He said I'd betrayed his trust by canceling his hotel and ruined his anniversary trip. He said he'd only asked me for help like family should and I'd turned it into some kind of revenge plot. His voice got louder as he talked about how much money the last-minute hotel cost and how Allegra barely spoke to him the whole trip. He said I was holding a grudge over nothing and making his marriage problems worse. The therapist listened without reacting and wrote notes. When Kevin finished, she asked him to explain why he expected me to miss my graduation. Kevin stumbled over his words. He said it wasn't about missing it, just postponing it to December. The therapist asked if he understood that ceremonies only happen on specific dates. Kevin said yeah, but family emergencies come first. She asked what the emergency was. Kevin said he'd already booked the trip and told Allegra about it. The therapist wrote something down and turned to me. I took a breath and started from the beginning. I told her about the LSAT that I missed because Kevin showed up with his kids claiming an emergency that turned out to be him wanting to go to a concert. I described my bachelor's graduation where he brought his sick kids, and I spent the ceremony in the bathroom instead of walking across the stage. I explained this master's degree took 6 years of night school while working full-time. I laid out how Kevin called 2 weeks before my graduation and demanded I skip it for his Hawaii trip. My voice stayed level even though my hands were shaking. I watched Kevin's face turn red as I listed each example. The therapist asked Kevin if he remembered these events. He said yeah, but those were different situations. She asked how they were different. He couldn't give a clear answer. He said something about how he only asked when he really needed help. The therapist asked if needing help meant other people had to sacrifice their important events. Kevin said family helps each other. She asked if that went both ways. Kevin went quiet. Then Allegra spoke up. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the anger underneath. She told the therapist about times Kevin had manipulated situations in their marriage. He'd told her parents she was too busy to visit when really he just didn't want to make the drive. He'd canceled plans with her friends by saying the babysitter fell through when he never called one. He'd convinced her I was selfish and never helped with the kids by lying about conversations we'd had. Allegra said she'd discovered he'd been painting me as the problem sister for years. Kevin tried to interrupt, but the therapist held up her hand. She told him to listen to how his actions affected people. Kevin's mouth snapped shut, but his leg bounced with frustration. Allegra kept going. She said she'd talked to Kevin's mom after the Hawaii trip and heard her say Kevin was sensitive and needed extra support. That conversation made her realize Kevin had been trained his whole life to expect special treatment. She said watching his reaction to not getting his way with me showed her a pattern she'd been ignoring in their marriage. The therapist asked Kevin what he was hearing. Kevin said everyone was ganging up on him. The therapist said that wasn't what she asked. She asked again what he heard when his wife and sister described his behavior. Kevin was quiet for a long moment. He finally said he heard that they thought he was selfish. The therapist said it wasn't about what they thought. It was about recognizing a pattern in his actions. She pointed out that in every example we'd shared, Kevin had prioritized his needs and schedule over other people's time and achievements. She said that showed a lack of respect for autonomy. Kevin argued that family is supposed to help each other. The therapist agreed but said help should be requested with respect for the other person's right to say no. She said what Kevin was describing wasn't asking for help. It was demanding compliance and using guilt when he didn't get his way. Kevin's face went through several expressions: anger, denial, confusion. The therapist asked if he could see how his pattern was damaging his relationships. Kevin said he guessed so, but his voice was defensive. The session went on for another 30 minutes. The therapist asked Kevin specific questions about why he felt entitled to other people's time. He gave vague answers about family obligation. She pushed back each time and made him think about the actual impact of his demands. By the end, Kevin looked exhausted. He hadn't had some big moment where he admitted everything and apologized, but he did agree to start individual therapy. The therapist told him his marriage and family relationships were at serious risk if he didn't work on this pattern. She said it bluntly without sugarcoating it. I could see something shift in Kevin's face. Not acceptance exactly, but maybe the first hint that this was real and had consequences. We left the office in silence. Allegra touched my arm and thanked me for coming. She said having concrete examples from outside their marriage helped the therapist see the full picture. Kevin walked to his car without saying anything to me. He looked less angry than before and more deflated, like someone had popped the balloon of his certainty that he was right. I drove home feeling drained but also relieved. The session hadn't fixed anything, but it was a start. 2 weeks later, my dad called and suggested a family dinner. Just him, my mom, Kevin, and me. He said it was time to clear the air and move forward. I didn't want to go. The idea of sitting across from Kevin at a restaurant and pretending everything was fine made my stomach hurt. But I also knew avoiding him forever wasn't realistic. We were family whether I liked it or not. I agreed but made my dad promise we'd meet somewhere public. I wasn't doing this at someone's house where emotions could explode without witnesses. We picked a chain restaurant halfway between my apartment and my parents' house, the kind of place with too bright lighting and laminated menus. I arrived first and got a table in the back corner. My parents showed up 5 minutes later. My mom hugged me tight and whispered that she was proud of me. My dad squeezed my shoulder. Kevin came in last, looking uncomfortable in a button-down shirt. He slid into the booth across from me and studied the menu like it was the most interesting thing he'd ever seen. We ordered drinks and appetizers while making small talk about work and the weather. Nobody mentioned graduation or Hawaii or therapy. Finally, my dad cleared his throat and said we needed to talk about what happened. Kevin put down his menu. He looked at me for the first time since sitting down. He said he was sorry for demanding I skip graduation. His voice was stiff, like he was reading from a script. He said he was sorry for the threatening voicemails. Then he added that he was under a lot of stress with the trip planning and work. I felt my jaw tighten. Even his apology came with excuses. I said I accepted his apology, but things needed to change going forward. I told him I wouldn't be his automatic backup for childcare anymore. If he wanted my help, he needed to ask respectfully and accept no as an answer. Kevin nodded but didn't say anything. My dad spoke up then. He said he'd been thinking about our family patterns and realized he'd noticed Kevin expecting special treatment for years. He said it needed to stop. Kevin's eyes went wide. He clearly expected our parents to take his side like always. My dad kept going. He said Kevin was an adult with his own family and needed to respect other people's schedules and boundaries. My mom added that she was sorry for enabling Kevin's behavior. She said she'd been making excuses for him since he was young and it wasn't fair to me. She promised to treat us more equally going forward. Kevin looked shocked. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. I could see him processing that our parents weren't going to automatically defend him anymore. The rest of dinner was awkward but productive. We set some basic rules. Kevin would ask for help at least 2 weeks in advance. I had the right to say no without guilt trips or manipulation. Our parents would stay neutral instead of pressuring me to accommodate him. Kevin agreed to all of it, though he still looked shell-shocked. When we left the restaurant, I felt lighter. The dinner hadn't been some magical fix. Kevin still tried to justify his behavior and shift blame. But it was progress. Our parents had backed me up. Kevin had apologized even if it wasn't perfect. And we had clear boundaries now instead of the unspoken expectation that I'd always give in. 3 weeks passed, and I got a text from Kevin that made me do a double take. He was asking if I could watch the kids in 2 months for a date night with Allegra. Not telling me, not demanding, actually asking with a please and everything. The message said he understood if I was busy and to let him know either way. I stared at my phone for a full minute trying to process this version of my brother, who used complete sentences and acknowledged I had my own schedule. I texted back that I could do it, and thanks for asking so far ahead. He sent a thumbs up. No guilt trip about how I owed him. No lecture about family obligations. Just a simple thanks and the date. This was how normal siblings were supposed to interact. I felt weird about how weird it felt. Grandmother called a few days later, sounding pleased with herself. She'd been talking to various family members, and apparently I'd started something. My cousin told Kevin she wouldn't do last-minute babysitting anymore, and needed at least a week's notice. My aunt informed him she had her own life and couldn't rearrange her plans for his convenience. Kevin's father-in-law apparently gave him an earful about respecting people's time after Allegra filled him in on the graduation situation. Grandmother said Kevin was learning the hard way that he couldn't manipulate everyone into being his personal support staff. She sounded proud when she said it looked like I'd inspired a minor rebellion. I laughed and said I just wanted to walk at my own graduation without drama. She said sometimes one person standing up makes others realize they can too. The family grapevine was buzzing with people comparing notes about times Kevin had pulled similar stunts, and they'd just gone along with it to keep the peace. Work became my escape from thinking about family dynamics. My boss called me into her office and congratulated me on the master's degree. She said a management position was opening up in 3 months, and she wanted me to apply. The role came with a significant raise and would put me in charge of a small team. She said my dedication to finishing school while working full-time showed exactly the kind of commitment they valued. I walked out of her office feeling validated in a way Kevin could never understand. He'd spent years making me feel selfish for prioritizing my education. Now that education was opening doors he'd never have access to. All those nights I'd stayed up studying after work shifts. All those weekends I'd spent writing papers instead of relaxing. It was paying off in concrete ways that had nothing to do with ceremonies or pieces of paper. A package arrived at my apartment with Mariana's name in the return address. Inside was a drawing she'd made at the school of the graduation ceremony. She'd drawn all of us wearing caps and gowns, even though only I had actually worn one. The stick figures had huge smiles, and she'd written in crayon at the top, "My aunt is the smartest." I felt my throat get tight looking at it. This 8-year-old had been paying attention. She'd seen me work hard and achieve something, and it mattered to her. I bought a simple black frame and put it on my desk at work right next to my actual diploma. Every time I looked at it, I remembered why standing up to Kevin had been the right choice. Not just for me, but for his kids who were watching and learning what it meant to respect other people's goals. Allegra texted me a month after graduation asking if I wanted to come to the kids' school play. She said Kevin would be there, but they were trying to do normal family things, and the kids really wanted me to see their performance. I agreed because I wasn't going to punish the kids for their father's behavior. The elementary school auditorium was packed with parents holding phones ready to record. I spotted Allegra and sat next to her. Kevin was on her other side looking uncomfortable in a button-down shirt. He nodded at me when I sat down. I nodded back. We didn't speak. The lights dimmed and kids filed onto the stage in homemade costumes. Mariana played a tree in the forest scene and took her role very seriously. The twins were rabbits and kept waving at us in the audience. After the show ended, we all stood in the lobby while the kids ran around hyped up on juice boxes and cookies. The atmosphere felt stiff, like we were all trying too hard to act normal. But the kids were happy to have both their aunt and parents there. That was what mattered. Kevin walked up to me as we were leaving and cleared his throat. He said thanks for coming. Then he added that his therapist had been helping him understand why he always felt like his needs should come first. He said it was hard to recognize the pattern when you'd been doing it your whole life. He admitted he still struggled with it, but he was working on being more aware. I appreciated the honesty even though I knew change would be slow. This was the most self-aware I'd ever heard him sound. I told him I was glad he was putting in the work. We stood there awkwardly for another minute before his kids ran up demanding he race them to the car. He gave me a small wave and followed them out. Allegra squeezed my arm and mouthed, "Thank you," before heading after her family. I started browsing vacation packages that night, sitting on my couch with my laptop. For years, I'd kept a specific amount in savings for Kevin's inevitable emergencies that would require me to drop everything. Money for last-minute plane tickets if he claimed something urgent. Money to cover my bills if I had to take unpaid time off work to help him. That fund had just been sitting there waiting to be used for his benefit. I realized I didn't need it anymore. I wasn't his backup plan. I transferred the money to a different account and started looking at beach resorts. Davina squealed when I called to tell her we were finally taking that graduation trip we'd talked about. No family obligations, no guilt trips, just us celebrating 6 years of night school and a master's degree, and me learning to put myself first. I booked a week in Mexico and felt lighter than I had in months. 2 months after graduation, things had settled into a routine that felt almost normal. Kevin still tested boundaries occasionally. He'd ask for favors with only a few days' notice or try to guilt me about family obligations. But when I said no, he actually backed off instead of launching into manipulation mode. The therapy was helping even if progress was slow. Allegra seemed happier when I talked to her. She said the marriage counseling was making them communicate better, and Kevin was learning to consider her feelings before making decisions. She kept her expectations realistic, though. She knew he wasn't going to transform into a completely different person overnight. But small improvements were better than nothing. My boss called me into her office again 6 weeks after our first conversation about the promotion. She had paperwork spread across her desk and a smile on her face. The management position was mine if I wanted it. Significant raise. Small team to supervise. More responsibility, but also more flexibility with my schedule. I signed the offer letter right there. That evening, I called my parents and grandmother and told them to clear their calendars for dinner that weekend. My treat. We met at a nice restaurant downtown. My mom hugged me tight and said she was proud of who I'd become. She apologized for taking so long to fully support me instead of always pushing me to accommodate Kevin. My dad raised his glass and toasted to my success. Grandmother winked at me across the table and said she knew I'd make it. The promotion validated every late night studying, every sacrifice I'd made, every time I'd chosen my education over Kevin's convenience. He'd spent years dismissing my degree as less important than his needs. Now that degree had advanced my career in ways he'd never understand. Kevin's anniversary rolled around again about 10 months after my graduation. My phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon while I was organizing files at my new desk. His name flashed on the screen and I braced myself for whatever demand was coming. But when I answered, his voice sounded different. Calmer, almost hesitant. He asked if I had a minute to talk about something. I told him sure and waited for the manipulation to start. Instead, he said he and Allegra wanted to take a weekend trip to a bed and breakfast about 2 hours away for their anniversary. He was calling 3 months in advance to ask if I'd be willing to watch the kids that weekend. Not telling me I had to. Not assuming I would. Actually asking. I checked my calendar even though I already knew I was free. The weekend worked for me. I told him yes and he sounded genuinely relieved. He thanked me and said he really appreciated it and he knew I was busy with my new job. We hung up and I sat there staring at my phone for a full minute. That was the first time in my entire adult life that Kevin had asked me for help with actual respect and advance notice. The therapy was working, maybe not completely transforming him into a different person, but enough that he could recognize when he needed to change his approach. The weekend came and Kevin dropped the kids off Friday evening with their bags packed and a detailed schedule of their activities and meals. He'd even included emergency contact numbers and the name of their pediatrician. Allegra hugged me and whispered thank you before they left. The kids bounced into my apartment excited to spend time with their aunt. We made homemade pizza for dinner and Mariana told me about her school project on famous scientists. The twins argued over which movie to watch and I let them vote democratically. Nobody mentioned any fighting between their parents. Nobody seemed stressed or worried. They just acted like normal kids having a fun sleepover at their aunt's place. Saturday we went to the science museum and the park. Ryder collected rocks and Zoe made friends with every dog we passed. Mariana asked questions about my job and said she wanted to work in an office someday. We got ice cream and played board games and stayed up too late watching cartoons. Sunday morning I made pancakes and the kids helped me flip them. We did crafts and read books, and by the time Kevin and Allegra came to pick them up, we were all tired but happy. Allegra pulled me aside while Kevin loaded the kids into the car. She looked more relaxed than I'd seen her in years. She told me the weekend away had been exactly what they needed. No kid interruptions, no stress, just the two of them reconnecting. Then she said something that surprised me. She said Kevin was really trying. The counseling was helping him understand that other people had schedules and feelings that mattered just as much as his. He still slipped into old patterns sometimes. He still had moments where he assumed his needs should come first. But now when she called him out on it, He actually stopped and thought about what he was doing instead of getting defensive. She said it was slow progress, but it was real progress. He was learning to consider how his actions affected other people before he made decisions. She squeezed my hand and thanked me again for standing up to him back at graduation. She said it had been the wake-up call their whole family needed. 6 months after my graduation, I was walking out of the grocery store with bags in both hands when someone called my name. I turned and saw a guy about Kevin's age heading toward me. It took me a second to recognize him as the college friend who'd called to yell at me about ruining Kevin's marriage. My stomach dropped. He stopped a few feet away and looked uncomfortable. He said he owed me an apology. He'd heard Kevin's side first and called me without getting the full story. He said Kevin had been talking to him about the therapy sessions and about recognizing his patterns of manipulation. He admitted that now that he was thinking about it, he'd seen Kevin pull similar stunts with other friends over the years, making plans and then changing them last minute, expecting people to drop everything to help him, getting angry when someone said no. He said he'd always written it off as Kevin being Kevin, but now he saw it was actually a problem. He apologized again and said he hoped I could forgive him for jumping to conclusions. I told him I appreciated the apology and I was glad Kevin was working on himself. We said goodbye and I walked to my car feeling lighter than I had in months. My new job kept me busy in the best possible way. The promotion had given me interesting projects and a team that actually respected my input. I had my own office with a window. I could set my own schedule within reason. I wasn't staying up until midnight studying anymore. I had time for friends and hobbies and myself. One afternoon, I was reviewing a report when I realized something. Standing up to Kevin hadn't just protected my graduation. It had started this whole chain reaction that was fixing multiple broken things in our family. The kids were watching all the adults set boundaries and respect each other. They were learning that it was okay to say no, that your achievements mattered. That family support meant actually supporting each other's important moments instead of demanding sacrifice. Allegra was more confident in her marriage because Kevin was finally being honest with her. My parents were treating Kevin and me more equally, instead of always expecting me to accommodate him. Even extended family members were setting their own boundaries with Kevin now. Family gatherings still got tense sometimes. Kevin still occasionally slipped back into his old entitled behavior. But now there were consequences. Now people called him out. Now I called him out without feeling guilty about it. My graduation day kept replaying in my mind sometimes. 3 little voices screaming, "That's our aunt," while I walked across that stage. The whole auditorium laughing and clapping. My grandmother making them honorary graduates. Those kids being so proud of me for finishing something I'd worked 6 years to achieve. That memory reminded me every single day that I'd made the right choice. That I deserved to celebrate my accomplishments without guilt. That real family support meant respecting each other's big moments instead of treating them like inconveniences.